Welcome to the Region Free Gamers podcast. Today, the best of the rest in 98.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Region Free Gamers podcast, the podcast that is fluent in gaming. My name is Ozzy, and I will be your host for a very special episode of the King of Games 98. We are now into the finals, but before we get into the actual finals, we want to talk about some of the games that we missed. But before we get into that, I want to remind you all that the best way you can support us is to go over to Apple Podcasts and take a very, very sturdy sledgehammer to that subscribe button. If you really want to make our day, though, then you can leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, and trust me, you will put a smile on all of our faces. So who do I have here today? Out in Canada, we have our dear friend, Paul Romalo. Hey, Paul.
Hey, everyone. I'm Paul. Apparently, I really like pancakes. I didn't realize this was a topic of conversation now.
Is this one of our inside topics, pancakes, the International House of Pancakes? I mean, we are region free, so they could kind of become our sponsor. We are working on that behind the scenes, guys. So eventually we'll be able to give you coupons for International House of Pancakes.
Which are useless to me, by the way. Like, I'm relegated to making them at home because, unlike Anthony, not all of us live only a stone's throw from IHOP.
That's a long time ago, Paul. That's not the life any of us live now.
Oh, that's true. Nobody's going to IHOP now.
Actually, let me rephrase that. I am actually in Miami. So recent developments, guys. Because of the pandemic, I decided to go from New York to my hometown of Miami. So as I record this, I am in sunny Miami with 80-degree weather and a beautiful sunshine outside my window. And guess what? Less than 1/4 of a mile away, an International House of Pancake with a drive-through. So,
son of a bitch.
Unbelievable.
Eat your heart out.
What is
I
going
am
on
trying to
over
make
there
connections there.
Anyway.
Anyways, yeah. So, there you go. I'm in Miami, so we are even more dispersed now. But out in Rhode Island, we have our youngster of the group, Arnaldo Perez.
I think that my IHOP is like 10 minutes away, if that makes you feel any better, Paul.
Oh, no, not really. Because my IHOP is a plane flight and then another hour probably.
And out in New York with an IHOP that is so close yet so far, we have our Bronx fiend, Anthony Arriaga.
Yucks, this sucks. I cannot go to IHOP right now. Like, this is making me so sad right now.
Region Free Gamers, brought to you by IHOP.
I would kill for an IHOP sponsorship.
I'm trying to make it happen, guys. I'm pulling all the strings.
I would sell every single one of you down the river for like just a couple coupons.
You know, it's funny you say that.
We'll be sending all our listeners a bunch of coupons, and we'll get all their addresses, and we're gonna spam them with IHOP. Coupons.
One of my friends, he actually has part ownership in an IHOP in Brooklyn. So,
oh really?
It's all coming together.
I can't believe this nonsense.
So you can only exercise the coupons we send you in the Bronx. Yes. So you have to risk life and limb in order to get your IHOP fix. All right, so with that digression out of the way, and it's a good way to get us back into character, I actually needed to spruce up some of the rust because I haven't been on an episode for a while. So I'm glad that we got that IHOP discussion out of the way. It really got me into character.
Are we really ever done with it, though, Ozzy? Because, like, I'm telling you right now, next episode, like, Arnie's going to be like, actually, I'm the CEO of IHOP. And, like, I'm
without getting into too much of a
anything.
digression, there's always this discussion with my fiance about IHOPs versus Denny's. And, Paul, I imagine you don't have Denny's in Canada, but
we do.
I actually prefer... Well, I prefer Denny's.
You prefer
I don't
Denny's?
know. I'm weird like that.
I don't know. It might be a Hispanic thing because when I was in Puerto Rico, like all we went to was Denny's, like every time.
But I think it's because it was what we had close to our school, and after we did our things on the weekend and we were out and about, we always ended up at Denny's at 3 in the morning.
Okay. This all makes sense now because, like, to me, having Denny's is like having Miller Lite versus a craft beer. You know what I mean?
Well, see, that was
Come
the
on,
thing
man.
is, like,
IHOP is no craft beer.
well, the
Come
thing
on,
is,
get the hell out of
like,
here.
For me, it was more like I go to IHOP when I look respectable, right? Like when I'm presentable. I go to Denny's when like I have nothing left to lose. And I'm just trying
IHOP is the place that you go to with your family after church on Sundays.
Yeah, exactly.
Denny's is the place that you end up when you're hungover.
Yeah, when you're a step
after
from
a
hell.
very
So
rough
they're
night.
both equally good for different points in your life.
Exactly.
This is true.
Two sides of the same coin, really.
All right, let's bring it back, guys. Let's just take it back. What are we doing here? We're doing games. And we're doing King of Games 98. Over the course of brainstorming which games we wanted to have as contestants in the King of Games 98 tournament, we had a lot of heated discussions. We had a lot of back and forth. We were very not in agreement about but which games we thought would belong in the King of Games 98. I mean, there were some clear choices: Legend of Zelda, Metal Gear Solid, StarCraft, but there were others, Spyro, that we didn't know whether they belonged there. But, eventually we learned, as the Beatles say, to, come together and just, try to make our differences go away and come up with something that would work for all of us, even if it was a very low baseline. I think we did okay. I think the games that we picked were all, at the very least, very, very good games.
I agree.
There's not a lot of regret, but the issue is that our criteria for choosing what contestant belongs there is very subjective. So, we all have different ideas of what we wanted in each particular game and what we were looking for. And because 98 was such a strong, phenomenal year, there were just a lot of games that if you try to boil it down to just 16, it was just impossible. I may not have agreed with Arnie. Arnie may not have agreed with me, and vice versa. It's fine. He's usually wrong. But, we agree to disagree. But we made the compromises. But at the end of the day, we were still wondering, what if? What were the other games that we didn't talk about that at the very least deserved a mention? And we felt like it was not fair to just kind of go through the whole tournament without making a mention of those episodes. So, we wanted to call this the Honourable Mentions episode because, we can chat about all the games that not all of them, but most of the games that we didn't pick, that we fought for, or that we really just wanted to give a shout out because they did something special. Yeah. So that's exactly what we're going to do with this episode. Each one of us will pick 2 games and we're going to get to talk about, why they deserve to be talked about and perhaps whether they deserve the spot in the rotation. So, why don't we get started? And we're going to start with the man up north. Paul, talk to us. Which is your first game that you would think deserves a spot in the rotation or that you want to talk about?
Ozzy, you know what? Actually, before we even do that, can I thank all of our listeners for listening?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's crazy because we didn't know if something like this was going to be popular or was, people were going to be receptive to it. And it seems like people really enjoyed this whole tournament. I mean,
Absolutely.
It's been a lot of work, mostly on Paul's side because it's just doubled the editing. But it's been certainly worth it. And I don't know, I've had a lot of fun talking about this. And at the very least, we're going to have some very good memories about the choices we made.
Absolutely.
It's made for some very light, light and fun discussions over Instagram. And, people have had disagreements and people have stumped for their games. And, I think it was a good format. So thank you everyone for listening and thank you for downloading it. I know it was a concept. It was an experiment, but it seems like, we did the right thing. So maybe at some point in the future, we can bring this back, in the form of, I don't know, King of Games 2001.
Yeah, we would probably bring it back, I would say, in a smaller format because there aren't really that many years as deep as 98.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, 2001, I would think, but it's still not as great as 98.
This one, we'll bring it back in a way that makes people less mad at us, hopefully.
Well, Arnie, I am sure you will find a way. You will find a way, my man. We can always count on you. You're, old reliable.
And one more thing, too, actually, just before I get to my game. Don't forget to rate and review. If you enjoyed the show, 5 stars, please. I know it's easy for us to get because, like, you start off on IHOP and Denny's, and the passion comes through, and we just forget things. So, you know.
But Paul, I did mention that, so I didn't forget it. So I'm not gonna let you get away with that.
Okay, you'll have to edit it out then. I could have sworn you didn't.
You don't remember me saying that we're gonna take a sledgehammer to the subscribe button?
I do now.
Exactly. Do not ever doubt my qualities as a host.
Awesome. All right. Now I know to like actually pay attention to what people are saying. This is good. It's a good lesson.
Yeah, it's fine. I mean, it's like, I don't know, 6:30 in your time, so you get a pass.
Yeah, I suppose so.
Since you're already engaged in that unnecessary digression, can you tell us what game you picked as your first game that you think is an honorable mention?
I picked a couple, and the first one is one that I really wanted to stump for, but it would have been impossible to convince you guys because it's one of those games. It's kind of like Panzer Dragoon Saga in that it's a game that not that many people played. I mean, definitely more people played Starsiege Tribes than Panzer Dragoon Saga. There's no doubt about it. It was a very, very popular game, just not as popular by any stretch of the imagination as, say, Half-Life, right? Mm-hmm. So just to give you some background on Tribes, basically it's a first-person shooter, but it's so much more. It's so much more. I can't even begin to explain, but I will try. Basically, with Tribes, you have a game that is a whole bunch of firsts for the genre, and you can totally see the influence that it had on the genre today. I would say that the FPS games of today probably have more in their look and feel. They have more to do with Tribes than they do with Quake or Doom, for example. Except for Doom 2016, right? Because, obviously. But basically with Tribes, what you have is a game that, it gave birth to open environments, for example, right? Like, I'll never forget the first time I played it, where every time you play Tribes, well, actually, I shouldn't say every time, because there are some games where you don't start inside of a base, but often you do start inside of a base, and so you're walking through corridors, and it's just like every other FPS, and then you go outside, and it's the first time in an FPS that you have this gigantic open environment, and with some of the maps, you actually jump off the base and you engage your jetpack and you float down to the ground. And that's really where the beauty of the game lies, is its verticality. There's kind of like a subgenre of FPS, the ZFPS, or I guess ZFPS if you're in America and you're saying it wrong. But, Tribes was the first one, and I would say to this day, still the best one. Like, I've played other games, I keep looking for games that have that kind of verticality, and, even to this day, none of them quite come close. The feel of Tribes is still unmatched, and yeah, you can see all the influences out there today.
What sort of games would you say are influenced by Starsiege Tribes, and what elements of Starsiege Tribes? Because I think the big distinction for Tribes, and I'm just going to call it that because eventually they dropped the Starsiege moniker. I think it's because it was a spin-off of another series, which was MetalTech, Earthsiege, and Starsiege.
That's right.
And so they just made it, kind of its own series. And Sierra Online published the game. It was developed by a company called Dynamics, and it came out in North America on December 23rd, 1998. But I think, as you said, the big distinction for Tribes was the jetpack. And the jetpack gave it that sense of verticality that you mentioned, and it also gave it a sense of speed that, you didn't necessarily see in other games at the time. I think that this game, eventually something like Unreal Tournament was very influenced by Starsiege Tribes. I think that particularly the 2003 and 2004 version of Unreal Tournament were very influenced by Tribes in terms of its wide open spaces and the ability to kind of go up. You would launch the disc in the air and then you would teleport. And so that sense of, you can rain death from above it's something that I think Tribes did first. But in your, mind, Paul, what are the games nowadays that you see kind of being influenced by Tribes? Because to me, I see more of a Call of Duty Battlefield influence than Tribes. So I'm kind of curious as to what elements you think kind of have seeped down in the DNA of new, first-person shooters.
Ironically, I would say Battlefield has more to do with Tribes than, for example, Doom or Quake, right? Because, you kind of had those two blueprints early on in the late 90s. You had the deathmatch FPS, which is what they all were, right? Quake was just released the year before, and virtually every FPS that came in the next couple of years, it was just all deathmatch. When Tribes comes out, it has all these different game modes. The netcode was absolutely brilliant, and it was the first game that allowed the possibility of up to, I think, 64 players on a map. Now, conventionally, you would have about 20 on a map most of the time, depending on which server you were playing on, but that's neither here nor there. So in that sense, I would say Battlefield has more to do with Tribes in that you have more cooperation, you have these open environments and large amount of players. And then, you have Overwatch, I would say that has more to do with Tribes as well, cribbing a lot of the team aspects, the modes. And, you might not think it, but Rocket League has a ton of its DNA in Tribes. It's hard to believe, but the lead, I think the director for Rocket League, or one of the directors anyway, Scott Rudy, he was the lead designer he was one of the lead designers during the Tribes era at Dynamics. He was actually working on an expansion for Tribes that never came out. And
interesting.
Yeah, with, for example, with Rocket League, so you have that, you have that guy, Ben and Adam Beckwith, they go back to Unreal Tournament, which you just mentioned now. They worked on a vehicle mod for it, which eventually became the game, and I couldn't believe this name when I saw it, Supersonic, Acrobatic, Rocket-Powered Battle Cars. Yeah. Which is
I can't imagine why Rocket League was more successful than that one.
And I'll tell you exactly why. Because when they were working on the sequel for Supersonic, Acrobatic, etc., what they did was they remembered a Tribes mod that was widely available during the era. It was called Tribes Football, and football being like soccer, again, with the Z and the Z there. So what they did was, well, we need, for Supersonic, Acrobatic, Rocket-Powered Battle Cars, we need to make more modes, right? Because we can't just have deathmatch. That doesn't cut it these days. And so what they did was they took Tribes Football and they added it to the Rocket Cars game. And then in their office, as the story goes, they could not stop playing the Rocket Cars soccer mode. And they were like, you know what? This needs to be the game. And then you have Rocket League. And that's how it's born.
It was a good decision. And I guess, you're right in the sense that before this, you had something, like the death matches, and you also had Quake 2. All of those were more corridor based. You had smaller contained spaces, and with Starsiege Tribes, it just kind of opened up this massive fields. And the reason why you could do that was because of the jetpack, because that wouldn't have worked in something like Quake, because if you didn't have a jetpack, it would have meant for a slower game.
Yeah, and if I might...
a slower, more visceral game.
And if I might interrupt, Ozzy, the other thing, it's not just the jetpack. What's commonly now known as skiing, a technique in the game, it's really one of the great stories from game development where something accidentally happens, sort of like the combo in Street Fighter 2. Somebody brings this glitch to the producer and they're like, hey, there's this glitch in the game, this bug. I'm not sure we should take it out though. And what they did was they left skiing in the game. And just to, a very brief summary of what it is, basically, if you jump down a hill and you keep hitting spacebar to jump, what it does is it removes the friction of landing on the ground. So when you remove the friction of landing on the ground and you keep jumping, you get to pick up these incredible amounts of speed going down a hill, and then you can seamlessly glide into a jetpack-powered flight. And basically what it did was it kind of obsoleted all the vehicles in the game, but when it did that, it just opened up this whole new type of gameplay that relied on speed and finesse, and again, the feel of it. I just have not seen it replicated. It was an incredible game.
Unlike Street Fighter 2, I mean, it eventually became a feature of the Tribes games. I mean, skiing was part of the Tribes experience. So I guess the last question before we move on to your other game, I mean, do you feel like, Tribes hit its peak with the first game, or do you feel like the sequels like Tribes 2 and Tribes Vengeance, I believe, do you feel like they, captured the feel of the original Tribes?
Commercially, Tribes 2 was the more successful one. The original Tribes did not sell very well. They removed copy protection from it on purpose. They wanted people to pirate it just because they wanted people to play it and get the word out, which, good on them. It was successful in that regard, and it paved the way for the great commercial success of Tribes 2. Mm-hmm. But Tribes 2 ended up kind of nerfing a lot of what made Tribes 1 so great. That, and it was very buggy. When it was first released, tons of patches. It wasn't, you can see the DNA there, but it never quite was the same. So to answer your question, the high point, I think to most people who were involved with the series would have been the first one. They just haven't quite been able to recapture the magic. And at this point, sadly, I don't think they ever will. The name of the game has kind of been tarnished. I don't think there's very much value in the IP anymore. Mm-hmm. And it's possible that the barrier to entry, because of the speed involved, is maybe a little bit too high. I think gamers had more patience in 99. I could just be generalizing, but with the amount of money...
I definitely agree.
Okay, good.
Yeah, and particularly PC gamers.
Yeah, and plus with the amount of money into development these days, like the original Tribes was made with a team of, I think, 17 to 20 people, which that's not going to happen today, right? Like they have to get a better return on their investment because they're just going to hire a ton more people.
Yeah.
Anyhow, that was a very long answer to your question.
And before we move on, I just want to say, if you want to play the Tribes games, all of them have been made available for free by the current license holder, Hi-Res Games. So if you want to try them out and you have a PC, you can do so for free. So you don't have to pirate it.
People still play the original to this day. It's quite incredible.
Yeah.
I imagine. All right, so let's move on. What's your second game, Paul?
Second game is Radiant Silvergun. And
nice, we get to finally talk about it.
I know. You and I had a little bit of a debate about this because none of us really thought of it originally. We thought of North American releases, but it turns out Radiant Silvergun was released in 98, just Japan only. So, it might have made the cut had we kind of expanded our release dates further, to the Japanese region, but we didn't do that. Perhaps we should have, though, because we are region-free gamers.
We probably should have, in hindsight.
Yeah, it was a debate. I think, we managed to get around the rule because of the loophole that it just never came out in North America. So we only have one release date, to rely on, and that's Japan.
Exactly.
So I think that, it's fine to talk about it as a 98 game. If we were using the North American release date, we would be talking about it as a 2011 game, because that's when it came out worldwide on the 360.
Yeah.
But we're not going to do that shit. So, Paul, why do you think Radiant Silvergun was special?
Oh, man, where do you even start with this game, right? Like, look, here's the thing. It's, to me, among a small handful of shoot-'em-ups that are just about perfect. The only thing that might be off-putting about it to some people is the challenge. And even then, I wouldn't say the challenge is that big a deal. Let's start with the soundtrack. Can we start with the soundtrack?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Hitoshi Sakamoto, you might know him as the guy who also scored Final Fantasy Tactics and Final Fantasy 12, which both have, especially Tactics, in my opinion, just have unreal soundtracks.
A very underrated composer.
Absolutely.
And one of them that's in the shadow of Nobuo Uematsu and others like Yasunori Mitsuda. It's really difficult to see that he just has not gotten the recognition he deserves, because the soundtrack to Final Fantasy 12 and Tactics are absolutely amazing.
Yeah, and as soon as I wrote his name down, the first thing that popped into my head was, how long until Ozzy craps on Uematsu? And the answer was 5 seconds.
That wasn't crapping. That wasn't crapping. That was just mentioning that he overshadows
Yes.
Sakamoto.
That is a fact.
And he shouldn't, in my opinion. Sakamoto should be right up there with him. But
and you know what I like about the soundtrack, because I got it on vinyl. It was one of those data disc releases, which I thought was amazing, and I'm really hoping that they come out with a few more treasure soundtracks like Guardian Heroes.
Yeah.
Because Guardian Heroes is also a phenomenal soundtrack, a very rocking soundtrack.
yeah.
What I like about this soundtrack is that it has a very clear leitmotif. It has like the same kind of main theme interspersed with all of its soundtracks.
Yes.
And it's a very orchestral, epic, not militaristic, in the sense of, marching snares, etc., but more in the sense of like, this is, our resistance. This is our last, defense, against a really massive enemy, or, we're facing very difficult odds. And it really manages to carry that feel across in its soundtrack.
Yeah,
I don't know
absolutely.
if you agree with that, Paul.
No, I completely agree. It has that kind of epic, almost desperate at times feel to it. And sometimes it's a little bit more subdued, depending on the level and the tone of the level. It really blends very, very well with the game and sounds like a soundtrack you wouldn't ordinarily find in a shoot 'em up, yet fits very, very well. And, not to take too long on Radiant Silvergun, but the fact of the matter is the gameplay is gameplay where you have a developer like Treasure, and they look at the shoot 'em up genre and they say, okay, what sucks about this? Okay, we're going to take that out and we're going to make it more simple. So, for example, in Radiant Silvergun, you don't have floating power-ups flying around. So you don't have that. Now, to be fair, there is tension involved in chasing floating power-ups, but in my opinion, generally speaking, kind of more annoying than not. Especially when the power-ups are like moving around and they're not static.
Yes.
This is kind of my issue with a game like Raiden. Radiant Silvergun is just like, you know what? We're getting rid of all that nonsense. You're going to have 6 weapons, 7 if you include the sword, which we'll get to in a second. And they can all be accessed by either one button if you have a 6-button controller, or button combinations if you have a 3-button controller. And it works perfectly. As you go through the game, the more you use a certain weapon, the more it levels up. And if you perform more combos, your weapons level up faster. So it's not just score that is increased when you destroy enemies in a certain way in order to combo. It's also your weapons leveling up. That's also your bonus. So that when you get to the end of the game, if you haven't been comboing, you're going to have underpowered weapons. It's a great little system for that game. The other thing is the sword, where if you hit, all 3 or all 6, or if you have shoulder buttons, a shoulder button on the Saturn, it pulls out a sword that absorbs bullets and effectively becomes the bomb. Like bullet hell shoot 'em ups nowadays, you see them, they're still fun in my opinion, but the bomb that you see in most bullet hell shoot 'em ups, I'll be honest, I think it's lazy. I think maybe make a game where you don't have to put yourself in a position where you're getting so overwhelmed with bullets that you need a bomb.
Yeah, so, I mean, and Paul, I just want to, interject here for a quick second. I think that Radiant Silvergun kind of represents kind of a digression in the evolution of the shooter genre. We were seeing kind of the death throes because of the death of the arcades, etc., of the shooter. And so we had companies, that came out of Toll Plan, like Cave, Aiding, and stuff like that, develop shooters and develop their own style of shooters. And then there was Treasure, which had not developed a shooter before Radiant Silvergun. And they just kind of went a very different route. They just went a completely different route from everyone else. And unfortunately, that route was kind of a dead end because no one else kind of followed it up. And it was only followed up with, Treasure's Ikaruga. And eventually all games became kind of Cave, inspired, essentially. And that's really unfortunate because I would have liked to have seen a future where all shoot 'em ups were inspired by Radiant Silvergun instead of Cave. So I don't know if you agree with that, but I feel like it was one of the last games to really represent an evolution of the shoot 'em up genre, that just did not pan out, as an influence on other shooters.
I couldn't agree more. And, not to be that guy, but I think it might be a matter of talent. The fact of the matter is, no matter what genre they tackled, Treasure just managed to do things in an innovative way, no matter what. And other developers just don't, right? Like, it's sad to say, and I know it's kind of, not being a game developer myself, maybe that's a little bit mean to say, but, the evidence is there.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about, it's like saying, we can compare, I don't know, Bob Dylan to, I don't know, Lil Nas X or Garth Brooks or something. It's like, yeah, I mean, they're both talented in their own way, but one is clearly superior to the other. And Treasure was, one of the most talented outfits, to ever be put together. And that's why I don't think we can ever recapture a company like that. But, we can leave that for a future Treasure episode, which it's definitely coming.
Oh, yeah.
I've only been meaning to do it since we started.
This is the most teased episode we've ever had.
Exactly. But no, I agree with you, Paul. But it's not a knock on a developer like Cave or any of the other competitors. I mean, it's just that, you're competing with the absolute best.
Yeah.
And it's funny because Radiant Silvergun just started as a side project, for one of the developers at Treasures. And they were just like, you know what, let's just make that into a full game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you can be Kobe and still be amazing, but you're not Michael Jordan. You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah. You know what? That's a very good analogy.
Let's just not speak ill of the recently deceased.
No, he's great. He's the second best player ever to do it.
All right, Paul. That was Radiant Silvergun. I know that there's a lot more that we can talk about, and certainly we're going to talk about Radiant Silvergun in the future. But I think we're running low on time, and so we're going to go ahead and take a quick break, and then we're going to come back with Arnie's picks. All right, everybody, and we're back, and we're going to talk with our friend Arnie. Arnie, what are the games that you really wanted to talk about and that you really wanted to push into the bracket, but were not able to?
So first things first, I thought of an even better analogy.
Nice.
Like, if Cave is Peyton Manning, right? And Treasure's Tom Brady. Like, they're both clearly very good. One of them is obviously superior in every way.
Except that Treasure's not a dick, so I think that analogy doesn't work.
And Treasure knew when to quit. And they were also always loyal to Sega. Just saying.
They went out on top.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Treasure is Rob Gronkowski and Sega is Tom Brady. They always
this is keep alienating our international listeners. Arnie, what is your first pick?
My first pick that I wanted to talk about was 1080 Snowboarding. 1080 Snowboarding was...
Oh, yeah.
We had a lot of discussion about, the last few games that were going to make it. I think Spyro was definitely one of them. Grim Fandango was another. And ultimately, I like the bracket that we ended up with, but I think if I was going to replace a game with something, it'd probably be 1080, because I like the idea of having a sports game in the mix, and I'm kind of sad that we did not end up having one.
Good point. I wish I had thought of that before, too.
Yeah, but I mean, to be fair, I mean, I think that sports games definitely have their place, but quality is quality, and I would definitely think that the games that we pick, I would pick them all, over 1080.
Yeah.
I don't think we needed to have like token games, just to represent a particular genre, if there were just superior games in there.
Yeah, absolutely. But 1080, honestly, is one that I just remember having a ton of fun with, and specifically I wanted to talk about it because I had this, like this show has done on multiple occasions. It's just like activated synapses in my brain that were not working before. So I had this like very vivid memory when I was living back in Puerto Rico, and I would go to my dentist when I was a kid, and he had 2 N64 kiosks in his like waiting room.
What the fuck?
Yeah, they were like these little tiny, I don't know if they were custom or what, but they were like these N64 things that he would put behind this locked like area that had like a TV over it. And so one of them was 1080 and the other one was Donkey Kong 64. And I remember every time I would go there, just like standing in front of the 1080 kiosk forever and just playing it over and over and over again.
Man. Oh my god, this is hilarious. Oh my god, Mom, my tooth is hurting again.
I would have like the best teeth ever.
This is the only doctor that I was like, please just take as long as you want. I don't need to be back. I need to stay here as long as possible.
That reminds me, Arnie, of you remember how at McDonald's there used to be Nintendo 64s, you know, everywhere, and they usually had like Pokemon, you know, games or something like that, like Pokemon Stadium and stuff.
Yeah.
I wonder what those like, you know, cabinets go for nowadays, like those you know, kind of setups.
Yeah, those I think I've seen people like buy them because they were very like the McDonald's ones were even cooler because they were always like colored in different bright colors and had like special designs on them and stuff.
Exactly.
But I remember I don't know, there was just something about like playing games on a kiosk back then. Like now I never do it. Even when I go to GameStop, there's like Nintendo Switches and stuff, or at like Walmart, and I never play any of them. But back then I was like, if I saw a kiosk, I was like, I have to stop.
Oh, absolutely.
And play it
for
sure. Like 5 minutes. But yeah, 1080 was one that I really enjoyed. I don't know. I think it sort of set the stage for my eventual love of games like Tony Hawk. It was just the first game that I remember in that extreme sports genre that really caught me. And again, I lived on a tropical island. I had not seen snow up to that point. Like, snowboarding was like for aliens. Like, I did.
Well, I think that was part of the appeal of it. No, I mean, I feel like. If, you know, I was in Miami and I feel like almost everybody I knew that had a Nintendo 64 had 1080 snowboarding. I mean, it's just that's the game, one of the games that everyone had together with like Wave Race. And, you know, for me, it was very appealing to play a snowboarding game because I had never seen snow. It was so magical and this thing that falls from the skies and makes everything awesome.
Oh, dude, please come shovel my driveway. It'll fill you with wonder.
I have lived in the North long enough to say no, hell no.
But yeah, so 1080 was one that basically immediately after we started, I was like, man, should we not have? But ultimately, Ozzy is right. Like, the games that we picked were better than 1080.
Well, let me just kind of say a story about 1080. I actually picked up, as you guys know, a bunch of old gaming magazines, and I picked one up, a GamePro from 1998, March of 1998, and this was just like a month before 1080 snowboarding would be released in North America, which was April 1, 1998. And there was an interview with Shigeru Miyamoto, and you know, they were asking him, you know, what's like the release date like? I mean, are we gonna see you know, Ocarina of Time anytime soon? And Miyamoto was like, no, it's not time. And then he said, well, you know, we really want to get 1080 snowboarding out because we want to, you know, we want to get it out before the snow season is done, you know, before the snowboarding season is done. And, you know, and I started doing 1080 because I like skiing. So I thought skiing would be fun, you know, so it's just funny how Miyamoto's like, oh, I like doing this thing. I'm going to put people to work doing the things that I like.
Yeah.
Especially over Zelda. Yeah. Like, guys, relax with this Zelda thing. It's not going to sell. 1080.
Well, that's exactly how I felt. I mean, I saw this guy talking about it, and it was like, Zelda will come out eventually.
Good for
him. You know, it's like, but you know what? I really want to get this game out. I want to get this game out before the snowboarding season is over because, man, I mean, that's the way to do it. So it was just funny to see like Nintendo's reasoning, and again, it just adds further support to my idea that Shigeru Miyamoto is a dictator and he's, you know, really not good for Nintendo. So.
Yeah. Well, but the other thing about 1082 is I did want to say for our listeners, because this is a running thing now where we all hate the N64 and like this is an N64 game I enjoyed.
I'm not saying anything. I don't want to piss off Skrilly.
This is one I liked.
No.
But it was produced by our boy Miyamoto-san, and it came out on April Fool's Day, which I also thought was hilarious.
Hey, Ocarina of Time is coming out. Fooled ya. Yeah, exactly. Here's a snowboarding game.
Here's 1080. Still sold like 2 million copies. People were like, I guess, like, what, you know, sure. Why not?
Yeah, I mean, and that was like a pretty big attach rate, I would think, you know, with the Nintendo 64, you know, like 2 million. That's pretty significant for back in the day. But, you know, what I remember about 1080 is just that it was very easy to pick up. You know, I feel like some of the snowboarding games, particularly the ones that came out later, you know, they were a little bit more inaccessible.
Yeah.
1080 felt like a game that even, you know, a kid, you know, could jump into it and just kind of have fun just going downhill.
Yeah.
So I think that that's kind of the appeal of it. It's just that pick up and play nature, which I think it's something that Nintendo does best. And to be fair, I think that's something that Miyamoto, you know, is very, very savvy at. He's very savvy at making a game accessible for all ages. And I think that's kind of his brilliance.
Yeah. I completely agree. I mean, that's all I remember about it is just playing it constantly. And I can't tell you if I was doing good or I was doing bad, but I was having fun with it. Like, it was one of those that it's just pure enjoyment from start to finish.
Yeah, and not that many sports games developed by Nintendo itself. There were a few on the 64, like I said, Wave Race, but it's just one of those, you know, Nintendo does sports, and, you know, you can kind of see their touch on a particular genre that tends to be very formulaic.
Yeah.
And you get to see those Nintendo, you know, flares, you know, and flourishes.
Yeah. This is a question I had, and I don't know if we should do this for the end or something like that, but I am also curious to get your guys' opinion. Like, if we had put a Radiant Silvergun or a 1080 in there, like, how well do you think that would have done as opposed to, like, another game? I think 1080 could have made round of 8 and then fallen off, depending on what it
I
went
completely
up against.
disagree. I
over
completely
Spyro,
disagree.
but that would kind of be where it ends. Like, if it went up against Grim Fandango, forget it. Grim Fandango would just destroyed it.
It's a juggernaut. Absolute juggernaut. I mean, it all depends on, you know, the particular game, but I would say it would have definitely been an underdog in the round of 16. You know, again, like Spyro.
Yeah.
I don't think that it would have gone very far. Something like Radiant Silvergun,
I think that's a contender.
I could definitely even see going into the semis, honestly.
Oh, yeah.
I think there's an argument to be made that it is one of, if not perhaps, the best shoot 'em up ever made. I see Paul shaking his head. Huh?
Yeah.
I agree with that. Like, I would say it's the best shoot 'em up ever made. I mean, obviously that's subjective, but, you know, boy, oh boy, the games we have in the semifinals, though. Whew.
Yeah, no, and to be fair, I mean, I think that we probably missed Radiant Silvergun when we were originally creating this, and, you know, it was probably because of the Japanese release date, and the lack of release on North America, but I definitely think that Radiant Silvergun would have gone the distance.
I think Radiant Silvergun has a similar path to Panzer Dragoon Saga.
Yes.
Perhaps.
Something like
it's
that.
probably the most close parallel.
Yeah.
But before we digress too much, Arnie, what's your second game that you want to talk about?
So my second game, like Paul's, and I'm glad Paul went first, is also cheating. It's Marvel.
It's not cheating. It's a loophole. Loopholes are not cheating.
It's Marvel vs. Capcom, Clash of Superheroes, I believe is the subtitle that I've never used. But that one had an arcade release in 98 and then a Dreamcast release in 99 and a PlayStation release in 2000. So we didn't do it. I think that was one we did talk about, but we decided to not do it because it was arcade, and that would have opened up a whole can of worms for other games that we may have wanted to include. I think Soul Calibur was another one that had an arcade release in 98. But yeah, Marvel vs. Capcom is another one, like, just for me, a lot of personal attachment to that game. I think I've talked about this before. I know I did on the Region Free Radio episode I did with Marvel vs. Capcom in it, that I specifically remember. That was a game I never owned, but every time I would come to my grandparents' house for the summer, I would bring my PlayStation, and the first day I got here, I would go to Blockbuster and I would rent it, and I would keep renting it until it was time to go home, and then I'd do it all over again every year. So Marvel vs. Capcom was like one that I have a ton of very fond memories of playing for hours by myself because I had no friends, as per usual. But no, I loved everything about it. Like, everything from the soundtrack, the character designs, the mechanics of battle. Like, I had never played a fighting game like that up to that point, and it really sort of turned me around on it, because I was not a huge, like, when I went to the arcade, I would play Street Fighter, I would play Mortal Kombat with my friends, but that's where fighting games were to me. Like, fighting games are arcade games. Like, that's where they belong. I'm not really interested in playing them at home. And then when I played Marvel vs. Capcom, I was like, this is something that I want to play all the time.
Yeah, and if I might add, just because the arcade release was 98, let me tell you, it was huge in the arcades. Because I remember when X-Men vs. Street Fighter came out, it was gigantic. Mm-hmm. Like, the lineups for the machines were absolutely bonkers. But then the sequel, Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, kind of more of the same. It didn't have quite the same impact. Marvel vs. Capcom, on the other hand, though, once you open it up and you include Mega Man and you include Captain Commando and Strider, like, it just explodes the possibilities, and it really kind of, rebirthed that kind of fighting game subgenre, at least from what I saw. Again, this is all anecdotal, right? I don't know how many quarters were put into all these machines. I don't have that data. I could probably find it if I really looked hard, but, we're just a little podcast. So I can just tell you anecdotally, it was a very big deal in the arcade.
But let me ask you something, Arnie. I mean, are you, thinking about the original game, or are the memories of the sequel kind of seeping into, the first game, and you're just kind of conflating the two? Because one of the things that I, compared to the second game, the roster of characters is much smaller in the first Marvel vs. Capcom. It's only about 15 characters.
Yeah.
Whereas the sequel just completely blew that up.
Oh, yeah.
So, is there an element here of conflating those two, or do you actually remember the first one being that one that you're, so passionate about?
I mean, I would not rule out the possibility that I am sort of tinging memories of the first with the second, but
Oh, no. Sorry, Arnie. I can totally rule it out, because Marvel vs. Capcom 2 wasn't even available on the PlayStation.
Yeah,
so
it was a PlayStation 2
You had to have been
game.
playing the first one.
Yeah.
Oh, so if you were playing the PlayStation version, I mean, because that one didn't even include tag team battles.
Yeah, I know.
So it was like Marvel vs. Capcom, not Marvel vs. Capcom.
Yeah.
So...
But that's the one I fell in love with. Like, I have terrible opinions, and this is just another one of them. But yeah, no.
But if it's all you've got, and you're fighting as Mega Man, and you're fighting as Spider-Man, and so on, like, and if you don't know any better, it's still an amazing game.
Yeah.
Arnie, don't know any better. That's the best way to summarize.
It's weird because Marvel vs. Capcom 1 and 2 are, like, very distinctly separate in my mind, because I never owned Marvel vs. Capcom 2 on console. That is one I exclusively played in arcades. I think I may have played it at friends' houses, like if they had it on their Xbox or something like that. Like, I may have played it there. But console-wise, Marvel vs. Capcom 1 on the PlayStation was the one that I remember constantly putting time into, and having to restart over and over again because I did not have a save for it. I think either I didn't have a memory card or I just never, like, saved it. I don't know what happened.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's very fair. And thank you, Paul, for pointing that out. I mean, that was a very nice technicality to put out there. I mean,
well, I mean, he's only 28. He's not senile yet.
Not yet.
Well, that's really fun. And, we can definitely say that Marvel vs. Capcom, really started up a whole set of, like, sub-fighting game genre, that whole fast-paced, aerial, tag team based, genre. I mean, you had King of Fighters before, but King of Fighters was much more methodical. And it didn't have that jump in and out, element of Marvel vs. Capcom. So, it definitely was an absolutely groundbreaking game from 1998. And to be fair, I mean, arcades are just as worthy as the consoles.
Yeah.
But do you think that it deserved a spot? If it hadn't been for kind of rules, but I think that, our rules are very flexible,
I mean,
as we have said in the past.
I definitely put it over Tekken 3 personally, as far as fighting games that I enjoy, but that might not be a popular opinion.
No, I agree with you. I'd put it over Tekken 3 as well based on quality, but it's really hard to measure the reach.
Yeah.
That's the real thing. And plus, like, a game like Marvel vs. Capcom that's ported over to console, it's ported over the next year. So you're going to have a very large segment of people who remember it mainly from the console release, much like yourself, right? So, you know, it's kind of...
Yeah, which was kind of butchered.
Yeah.
Because
Nonetheless.
the PlayStation just couldn't handle those 2D games, unfortunately.
It was not a good port, you know, but it didn't really have to be for what it was trying to accomplish. So...
Yeah.
You know,
well, and there's the element here of, you know, Tekken 3 being a 3D game and, you know, kind of having that allure of this is the hot new thing, whereas 2D, you know, fighting games were kind of yesterday's news. So, you know, I don't agree with that, but definitely I could see how that seeps into your evaluation of the two games itself. And again, I just cannot separate the console ports from the first Marvel vs. Capcom, and the fact that the sequel was just so much better, in every way, because it just added so much more stuff. But I think that the first one was still a very, very worthwhile game, and you know, it probably deserved a spot. And it's good to hear, Arnie, that you would have dropped Tekken 3 from it, you know, in order to put it in there. So
or Spyro, or honestly even Grim Fandango. Like, I love Marvel vs.
Grim Fandango.
Oh, what a Judas!
So that means that you would have just dropped out StarCraft over it as well.
Yeah, probably. I love Marvel vs. Capcom. Like, the second one is superior to the first in every way, but the first like holds a special place in my heart.
See, this is why we always hold our breath whenever we let Arnie pick anything, because we just don't know what's going to happen. But in any event, thanks, Arnie. Anything else you want to give as a parting statement on your games and the honorable mention?
I mean, honestly, I think we're gonna do a little bit of this at the end, but I think people really just need to like look at a list of games from 1998 and understand
and see how hard this was.
Our conflict, like. We're going to talk about, like, what, eight games here, and there's still probably another 8 that we could have talked about.
Easily.
Exactly.
Like, it's just crazy. I'm glad that it's gone over as well as it has, considering that I think a lot of people would justifiably be upset at some exclusions. But I don't know, man. It was a hell of a year. Like...
Yeah,
it's a hell of a drug, man. 1998.
Vintage year. All right, with that, let's take another quick break, and we'll come back with Anthony's pick. All right, everybody, and we find our way back home. Anthony, you're out there in the Bronx. Tell us, what would you have picked? You actually weren't involved in the original discussion, so you didn't really get to have a say in which titles actually ended up making the round of 16. So let's just call this the before Anthony, period. BA. So, Anthony, what games do you want to talk about? Give us your first choice.
Well, it's funny because the two games I'm picking are for the rare 64. And
a lot of 64 love on
this. And
nice
I know my first choice wouldn't have been picked. I wouldn't even have picked it, but I think it deserves to be mentioned as a 98 release, and that's NFL Blitz.
Yes.
Yep.
Especially on the Nintendo 64.
A game we have talked about before.
That's the one I was waiting for. That's the one I wanted to play. And it's funny because...
Well, on the Nintendo 64, but also on the arcades. I mean, you can't understate the importance of NFL Blitz.
Well, that was the whole thing, just much like NBA Jam before it, this was the arcadey, the non-sim-based game version of something that most people wouldn't have played normally, but could jump right in and play this. And even looking back on it now, it's a game that would never be made right now. They would never make this game right now.
No. At least you wouldn't have licensed teams, like it would have been the same way that the later Blitz games were, they would just have to make up their own teams because it's just too brutal.
I know.
And particularly now with traumatic brain injuries, it's like, we don't want to promote this game. It's terrible. Like your player is about to become suicidal because of all the concussions.
Oh, man. So this could have just been like what the XFL, the first XFL was supposed to be. Was based on NFL Blitz.
R.I.P. XFL.
Poor XFL. Every 19 years it comes back and dies. So we'll see what happens. But no, but it was
So what makes this game stand out for you? I mean, what in your mind makes you want to shout about this game as one of the highlights of 98?
Because for me, and I've said this before, I used to play a lot of sports games growing up. So, but not all my friends were into sports like I was, or could play sports games like this. You know, they just couldn't get into it. This was a game that I had no problem having guys come over and just like jump right in. Yeah. And that just made it so much more fun to me because it just gave me something to actually play local multiplayer with someone. And it was just the simplicity of it. You know, I used to, before this, I guess Tecmo Bowl was my game back in the 8-bit era.
Yep.
So this was like Tecmo Bowl on steroids, but just in the evolution almost of what Tecmo Bowl would be. And it just made it was just so simple to play, man. It was just so much fun. It was just the play selections, everything. Like I had like one of my best friends, Mark, he didn't know shit about football. But, you know, he came over and we used to get down with some NFL Blitz and the motherfucker used to beat me, you know, so, which, you know, like when you're really good at a sports game, especially, nobody wants to play, but when they beat you, you almost feel like, okay, cool, there's some competition here, you know?
Yeah.
You know, much like Jordan and Pippen back in the day.
Yeah.
So that's what made it so much fun to me. And I remember this was like this might be a deep cut for some people, but the arcade cabinets used to have this almost a memory card slot on the side of the unit that you could bring your Nintendo 64 plays or whatever.
Oh, and you could do a season, right?
You could pop it right into the arcade cabinet.
Wow. And I didn't know that.
I remember picking up because, you know, like everything used to come out for all the different format, you know, all the different consoles. I remember like, oh, I'm going to get the Nintendo 64 version because I want that option, which I never used. Yeah. I never, like, who does that shit? No one does that.
Sure, yeah.
But still, you just wanted that option, you know?
And the N64 version has that cool thing where if you throw the ball more than 30 yards, it just like vanishes into the fog.
Yes. You got to play the run and gun, baby.
Yeah, it's
it had the special fog effects.
Yeah, it's what you say, Anthony, because like games like Blitz are fun for me personally because people shit on sports games a lot for being boring or just being copy pasted or whatever, but sports games are some of the games that have the highest barrier to entry. I don't know if that's just me. Like I can do like 100-hour RPG with like the most complicated battle systems you could possibly imagine, and then I pop in Madden and I'm like, I have no clue.
Lost,
like,
right?
I don't know what's happening.
Right.
Yeah.
But something like Blitz sort of cuts through the noise, and it's just like, here's a thing, do it, have fun, and it's like dumb simple, and I love that.
Yeah,
and I'm like, oh, I'm finally understanding like why people enjoy this stuff.
Yeah, that's you know Midway did a great job of taking that NBA Jam formula and just making it NFL. I mean, NFL definitely wasn't gonna be as popular as what NBA Jam did. NBA Jam was just like its own animal, but still, this was like a great way to just play sports games if you weren't a sports fan. And I think a lot of people that played, probably most of the people that played NFL Blitz weren't even NFL fans. It was just a good party game.
Yeah, and also the other good part about it, and it's something that it's very good about the Nintendo 64. Hey, we say nice things about the 64 as well. It's that you had the 4 controller ports.
Yes.
And so it made for the perfect kind of party platform. And NFL Blitz was just one of those games that lent themselves very well to that. And particularly with the fact that NBA Jam just, you know, was not as popular on the 64. I mean, this was the game that was, you know, your go-to pick up and play sports games with friends.
Right. That's actually a really good point because I had NBA Hang Time on the Nintendo 64, which I had a great time playing and everything. But NFL Blitz on the Nintendo 64 was a game everybody was like talking about. This was something that, you know, everyone had to play on the Nintendo 64.
Yeah,
exactly. All right, so well,
oh no,
go ahead, Arnie.
I just wanted to say something really quick about that too. Is like I just remember because NBA Live '99 was a game that my dad got me when he got our Nintendo 64, and we used to play it all the time, and he would just whoop the shit out of me until one day, because I didn't know the rules of basketball. Like, I was goaltending like a motherfucker. I was like running out of bounds until one day I realized I can turn off all the rules. And then immediately he was like, "What is happening?" And I was like, "Haha, I got you now."
You're a monster.
I always preferred like the arcadey, like the less rules the better, so I don't have to like actually strategize.
Yeah. So with that, let us know, what is your second game, Anthony?
So my second game is a game that I think you could argue that it could have been in that. It could have been in the final count of the games we battled with, but Rogue Squadron for the Nintendo 64. And
so that's Star Wars.
Yes. And
so you still have your streak of talking about Star Wars in every episode.
I don't know what happens, man. It just takes over. But
yeah, so what makes you think that this game deserves a spot? I mean, I'm not disagreeing. I'm just asking, why do you think this game should be discussed?
So we've been inundated with Star Wars. Like, it's all over now. But back in '98, that wasn't the case. Like, we had Return of the Jedi, and we had no new Star Wars stuff at all. It was
starving.
Yeah, and it was Shadows of the Empire on Nintendo 64, which that Hoth level, I think, just really got people thirsty for what Star Wars Rogue Squadron would be.
Yes.
So like I said, we had no Star Wars stuff. And so this was basically like the closest you could get to a Star Wars movie. And especially if you weren't a PC gamer, because the PC gamers were getting all the good Star Wars space combat stuff.
Oh, yeah.
This was the first one where if you had a regular, just basic ass console, you were able to play a Star Wars game. And I don't know, man, it was just, this game just was so good, man. It was just the dog fights, the being able to, try out these different ships and all controlling differently in the Star Wars universe. It was crazy. And I remember I picked this game up when I had the flu. I picked this game up and I got the flu like a few days later. So I was kind of home all week just playing Rogue Squadron. And it was the best time of my life, man.
One of the best things in those kind of Star Wars games really is the ability for different vehicles. Because, look, the X-Wing is, the greatest spaceship design ever.
Right.
Yeah. Some people will say the Millennium Falcon, and that's cool. It's okay to be wrong. But the X-Wing is the coolest thing. But, in these Star Wars games where you fly different ships around, the ability to fly, and I can't remember if this was available in Rogue Squadron, so don't quote me, but in X-Wing and TIE Fighter, for example, on the PC, the Y-Wing, the A-Wing, all these different ships, all this stuff that you just never kind of would have thought of, and they all have different kind of handling, and they're all very well thought out, and they just add so much more to that Star Wars universe that we love.
Right. And it was because every you had separate missions, so you had to use any particular ship as per the mission. So it wasn't like you were just flying around with an X-Wing all the time. But yeah, but the X-Wing, of course, the X-Wing was the guy the one you wanted to go into dogfights with. And up until this point, I had played Star Wars Arcade on the 32X. I had played Rebel Assault on the Sega CD, right? This is what I was getting. This is what I was getting. And then one of my best friends, he had all the Star Wars games on his PC, but I didn't have a PC and I didn't have the time to install all 35 of those discs to play the first level. So this was it for me. This was finally where I felt oh, this is so cool. Now I'm finally here. I'm finally at the time thinking, oh, this is PC level. Yes, This is it.
Yeah, and there's also another element to this, Anthony, and that's that, as opposed to X-Wing or X-Wing Alliance or X-Wing versus TIE Fighter, I mean, all those games had a pretty high barrier of entry, not only because you need a PC, but because they were complex games, with actual, in-depth physics, and, they were more of a simulation, as much as you can call that about a fantasy, space game, than, just a pick up and play arcade experience. Right. And so with something like, X-Wing, you needed a HOTA, the thrust, the joystick, essentially, to kind of get the full experience out of it. It wasn't a game that you could play with a pad. And it certainly wasn't a game that you could play with a keyboard. Yeah. I mean, you could try, but
I did. It was like a workout, man. Like, the keyboard wasn't so bad. It was the mouse, because you're constantly like, it's almost like you're scraping at a wall. You're just like constantly moving the mouse from, top to bottom or bottom to top in order to get your ship to move around. It was definitely a game where you prefer to have a joystick. Anyway.
I think if you roll credits on X-Wing with a mouse and keyboard, you just get a pilot's license, like at the end of it. You're like certified.
Well, and there's also, the fact that the 64 controller lent itself very well to a game like Rogue Squadron, because it had that built-in analog. Mm-hmm. And so you could kind of take advantage of, the 360 degrees of motion, with that controller. And look at all the nice things we're saying about the 64. Right? So I think that it was kind of the perfect segue into introducing dogfights and space battles, for a different generation that was not weaned on the PCs. And so from this, we saw Battle for Naboo, we saw the Rogue Squadron sequels, and we also saw games like Starfighter and Jedi Starfighter on the PS2 and the Xbox. So, Rogue Squadron was certainly influential. I guess a question from me to you, Anthony, did you follow up with the later Rogue Squadron games and Battle for Naboo on the 64?
I played a little bit of Battle for Naboo. Not that much though. I mean, it didn't have that same feel for me as this one. This one just kind of like, this one just took up all my time. Battle for Naboo, I didn't really spend too much time playing. But talk about the GameCube. I got the sequels for the GameCube. And those things have...
Dude, Rogue
still
Leader,
an impressive graphical showcase. Rogue Leader is still impressive.
Yeah. It might be my favorite GameCube game, honestly, Rogue Leader. Like, the GameCube, it's got a good library, but god damn, man, Rogue Leader is so good.
And you know what those games did well as well? I mean, it was the set pieces. Yeah. Those games managed to capture the set pieces of Star Wars just very well. And it made you feel like you were part of the Rogue Squadron. Yeah. Like you were Luke Skywalker or Wedge, or whatever, in there. So, I think that, for a generation of gamers, this was their experience with kind of inhabiting Star Wars. Yeah. And for the time when we were kind of starved and still waiting for episode 1, this game kind of scratched that itch. And I guess that's my next question, Anthony. I mean, did this game make you more excited about episode 1?
Probably. It probably did. I thought.
So maybe that's a knock against it. So
no, it's impressive looking back. I thought, oh man, George Lucas could do no wrong. This is going to be amazing.
Well, first I want to say to Paul, I'm more of a Slave One man myself, like Boba Fett's ship. I think that was the best.
Hell yeah.
But I remember my dad, during this time, used to work for Frito-Lay. So whenever I would go...
How did we not know this?
Yeah. He worked for Frito-Lay for years. Like, I remember all the things that used to come in, like, the bags of chips and stuff. He would just give me, like, stacks of them. Like, I remember in Puerto Rico, they did these, like, Pog sort of things that people just collected and loved in school. They were called Tazos. I don't know if you guys even know what I'm talking about right now.
Sounds vaguely familiar.
But, I had, like, stacks of these things that I would just bring to school.
Jesus Christ, dude. My dad worked at a factory that made bricks.
And Paul will get bricks all the time. And he's like, oh, thank you, Dad. This brick is awesome.
Who needs Lego? Here you go.
But I specifically remember during this time, like, the Star Wars marketing was insane. Yeah. Like, I would walk into his office and you'd see like all these episode 1 standees of like Sebulba or something, and like all these like marketing gimmicks they were getting ready, because it was also like Pepsi owned. Like Frito-Lay and Pepsi were like, I don't know if they're shared by the same company or whatever, but they're very closely tied. So I would get to see all the promotional materials they were getting ready for like some of this stuff, and it was, I mean, that's why I was hyped, because I was like, oh my god, everybody's like, this is the greatest thing that's ever happened.
All right. Any parting shots, Anthony?
Nah, I mean, I think this was a great game. Factor 5 did a great job with these games, man. And it was definitely, I'd put it up there, man. It was definitely probably one of the top games of 98 for me. I mean, I just had so much fun.
Do you think it would have made it past the round of 16?
I think so, yeah. I think Ocarina of Time, seriously? Get out of here.
Yeah, you're right.
So if you had to put this game in and substitute another game, which one would it have been? Just because I want to add fire.
Yeah, you want to add some real fire? Throw some fire in here. No, I think...
just say Xenogears, it's fine. We all understand.
Oh, you know what? I forgot all about it. Yeah, easily. Xenogears.
That's all the answer we need. He forgot all about it.
And with that, we're going to take another break, and I'm going to come back with my games, which shouldn't take too much time because I've already talked about them quite a lot.
Yeah.
So we'll be back. And we're now in the home stretch, and there's only me left because Geoff didn't make it. And actually, before we get into it, let's just talk about Geoff. Let's talk about what Geoff would have picked, since he's not here, but we definitely want to make his presence felt. So Geoff, of course, being over in Europe, he has different tastes. He drinks tea, not coffee. All that jazz. All those cliches. And so he decided to pick two games as honorable mentions, as we all did, and one of them was Street Fighter Alpha 3. So this is another one of those loophole games where it came out in the arcade in 1998. So even in North America, it came out in 1998. And can we all agree that Street Fighter Alpha 3 is the best Street Fighter game of all time?
Ooh. No, we can't.
Damn it. I really thought I had you there.
It's amazing. Don't get me wrong.
Great.
And I would say it's the pinnacle of the Alpha series. But as far as Street Fighter games go, there are so many, and they're all so good for different reasons. Mm-hmm. It's I couldn't say personally that Alpha 3 is the best one.
All right.
Yeah, I know you're really big on the EX games.
All
so
right. Alpha 3 Arcade. Paul, Alpha 3 Arcade versus Marvel vs. Capcom Arcade. Go.
I would take Alpha 3 over Marvel vs. Capcom Arcade. But as far as like impact in the moment, the Marvel vs. Capcom machine, way more people playing it than Alpha 3.
Yeah, and it's just, people were starved at the time for a new Street Fighter, that was a follow-up to Street Fighter 2. And so I think at the time, Street Fighter 3 was still in development.
Yeah.
And so Street Fighter Alpha 3 kind of really filled that void. And if it wasn't because people were eagerly waiting for Street Fighter 3, I think this game would have been immediately recognized. If they had labeled this game Street Fighter 3, I think people would have been like, yep, this is great, this is perfect, this is exactly what I wanted.
Yeah.
This is the perfect follow-up.
Yeah, but Capcom dug their own hole with the naming conventions as far back as Street Fighter 2.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's all them.
Because the Alpha series just kind of steadily kept improving.
Yeah.
They had a very good foundation with the first Alpha game. The second Alpha game was very good. And then Alpha 3 just blew it up, particularly with the isms, that different playstyle that you could pick and choose, and just the massive roster of characters. They just kept adding characters and more characters with each iteration. And so I think that, this game really deserved a spot in the top tier of Street Fighter games. I think it's definitely top 3, I would say, in terms of Street Fighter. But, the fact that Street Fighter 3 was just around the corner made people kind of think, okay, well, this is not the real follow-up.
Yeah.
But if it had been, I don't think many people would have complained.
And Alpha 3, was that the one that also got, like, a really good GBA port? Or was that a different
I think so,
one?
yes. No. It was Alpha 3. Yeah, it was Alpha 3. Street Fighter Alpha 3, great game. Mm-hmm. Came out on the arcades. Another quarter muncher. A ton of people played this game. Yep. It also introduced us to Armika. We all love Armika and her ridiculous design. So keep it coming, Capcom. We want more Armika. Waifu for life. Anyways, and so the other game that Geoff wanted to mention was Tenchu, Stealth Assassins.
Yes.
And you know what? 98 was the birth of the stealth game. 98 was really a seminal year for stealth games. So we already talked about Metal Gear Solid.
Yep.
We already talked about Thief.
Yep.
And then there was the other stealth game, and that was Tenchu. And I think Tenchu is definitely like the B, level of stealth games. I don't think it's quite up there at the AAA level. But it did so many things that eventually ended up becoming influential in the stealth genre. And it kind of did that parallel to Metal Gear Solid, which is impressive in its own right. And so it didn't have the production quality of Metal Gear Solid. It certainly didn't have the polish of Metal Gear Solid, but it offered a different brand of stealth, one that was more unforgiving and one that was more in line with being a ninja. Metal Gear Solid, stealth was definitely huge, but there was more of an emphasis on the action component of it, of you running away and, the countdown, running down, in order to cool down. Tenchu was the type of game that if you fucked up, it would have been very difficult to kind of get back into it. A really punishing game. So Paul, you have any thoughts on Tenchu itself?
I don't really have very much in the way of detail. There wasn't anything that I had time to look up. I can only tell you that I remember playing it and really, really liking it. It was an excellent game, and because it was kind of new, and it's like you said, it's a very different kind of stealth game than Metal Gear. I just thought, even the controls I thought were like, it's hard to crap on Metal Gear for controls, right? It's just that it's very simple. It's an overhead view. But Tenchu's a little bit more complex, and I thought it controlled really well for a fairly early 3D game.
Yeah, I mean, the difficulties with that, and this is a difficulty with almost every PS1 game, was the camera.
Yeah.
The camera was just brutal to control. And I think that's really one of the components that makes Tenchu a much more difficult game. But with Tenchu, I would call it more of a simulation than the plot-driven action of Metal Gear Solid.
Yeah.
And, personally, I favor Metal Gear Solid, but I think there's definitely a spot, for a game like Tenchu, to coexist with that. All right, so I guess that only leaves me. And so the first game I want to talk about, I have talked about ad nauseum, and that's Parasite Eve.
Yeah.
Man, I really fought for this game. I would have personally put, this game over some of the ones that we picked.
Yeah.
Certainly over Spiral, certainly over Grim Fandango.
Yeah.
Maybe even over Tekken 3, honestly. But at the end of the day, we decided that it was between this or Xenogears. Yep. And lest it be said that I did not go to bat for Xenogears. I actually said Xenogears should earn the spot.
Yes.
So that meant that Parasite Eve,
I think that was ultimately
was
our last cut was Parasite Eve. Parasite Eve was this close.
Yeah.
To making it.
Yeah, so literally this is number 17 in our 16 exactly. Seed tournament. It really was the last cut. That was the one that finalized the final match. But I think it's just one of those games that's very underappreciated. Still to this day it's underappreciated because of how well it merged, plot, how well it merged survival horror with an RPG in the vein almost of Chrono Trigger, because it had the same battle designer as Chrono Trigger. And we've talked about Parasite Eve in a full episode, and so we don't need to go into detail about it again. But, I think all of the elements of the game came very well together. The story was very, very intriguing. The relationship between Aya Brea and Eva was very, interesting. And the music from Yoko Shimomura was absolutely blow your mind amazing.
Yep.
The CG cutscenes that came in and out. And it was also a perfectly tight, game. You could beat it in like 8 to 10 hours and just have a really good experience with it. It wasn't like this super grindy RPG. And so for someone that's not really into RPGs, this is kind of like the perfect gateway drug. If I was to recommend any RPGs, as a starter, this would probably be the game because it gives you just enough control, so that you don't have the person asking, why can't I move the characters, in the battles? So you can actually control the character, you can position yourself. And that kind of positioning element is so, liberating in a way.
Yeah.
And it just has enough action flourishes, that it allows you to, you know, kind of get the mechanics of what an RPG is like without playing a full-blown RPG. And so, I don't know. I mean, it's not, let's not say that it's, you know, the best game that Squaresoft ever made, but it's definitely a very high quality game that I think is underappreciated to this day. And I think for sure, if we had put it in there, I think it would have probably made it to the round of 8.
Yeah. Depending on what it went up against.
Maybe wouldn't have gotten past it. But depending upon what, you know, if it would have gone against Ocarina of Time, if it would have gone up against Metal Gear Solid, certainly it would not have, you know, gone forward. But maybe it would have had a shot against Tekken 3. Maybe it would have had a shot against, you know, Pokemon.
I will say one of the things about Parasite Eve that I guess I didn't appreciate until we really started doing the tournament, and this coming from someone who played it for the first time last year, is that it's surprisingly very playable. There's quite a few games on this list that when we've been discussing them, we've sort of been like, it's a game that I really loved, and, you know, thinking on it in the context of 1998, amazing. Thinking about it now, maybe doesn't play as well as it used to, but Parasite Eve is one of those that still plays very well.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, and it's a mix of many things. I mean, one of those is that it has aged very well graphically because of the pre-rendered backgrounds.
Yeah.
And that has allowed it to kind of keep its beautiful look. And the other thing is, like I said, you know, the mechanics are not so complex that you can, you know, that you would need a manual in order to learn them. So, you know, it's one of those games that has aged probably the best, you know, out of the 98 games. You know, it's certainly aged better than a game like Thief, than a game like Baldur's Gate, etc. So
even Half-Life, honestly. Yeah. Like, you know, it's aged better than that. And if I might add, excellent New Game Plus mode in Parasite Eve. Like, it's almost a completely different game.
Absolutely. I mean, you could keep playing it, you know, and it adds so much replay value. And I don't think many people realized that there was a New Game Plus in Parasite Eve. But it adds, like, you know, hours upon hours of additional content.
We'll always have the Chrysler building.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, amazing game. I really wish that I would have talked a little bit more about it. I don't know. Maybe at some point we'll do a dedicated Parasite Eve episode. I don't know if there's enough in those bones to kind of, you know, after we have discussed it so much to kind of go with a full episode. But, you know, it's definitely one of those games that is very close to my heart. And so with that, I mean, let's go to the second game. And guess what? It's another Squaresoft game because Squaresoft had a phenomenal run on the PS1. We love Squaresoft on the PS1. And that game is One-Hander, or as it's actually called, Einhander. So, you know, what an amazing game. Just a left field game from Squaresoft. I mean, who would have thought that Squaresoft would have knocked it out of the park in any genre that they would have decided to tackle? I mean, they were known as the RPG makers. And then they just came out with a fighting game in Bushido Blade, another honorable mention.
Bushido Blade 2,
Yeah, Bushido Blade 2. And they came out with a racing game eventually. And it's just Squaresoft could do no wrong at the time. And so in this year, where you have Radiant Silvergun, which is one of the best shoot 'em ups ever made, you also have Einhander, which also has a stake in being one of the top shoot 'em ups ever made, I think. And that game, when I first played it, I played it in a demo, because Squaresoft was very good about, you know, putting its games on demos, you know, back in the day. And I just remember one thing that struck out at me. I must have been like 8, so I was pretty young, or 9. And I just remember the operatic, you know, soundtrack. You know, it was a very techno electronica soundtrack, but with opera in the background. And it just had a very menacing tone to it. And just the way that you could switch, you know, your guns and stuff like that. And you could pick up guns, you know, you would take down enemies and, you know, you would absorb their guns and stuff like that. It just made it for it was my first introduction to a shoot 'em up game. So that's the first thing. And so I think that gave me the impression that all shoot 'em up games were like this. And that's not quite the case. And I just think that this is one of those games that, you know, maybe it didn't deserve a spot in the run of 16. In fact, I'm fairly sure that, you know, it did not. But at the same time, it's so underappreciated. It's just one of those games that just deserves to be mentioned a lot more. And at the end of the day, I guess that goes to the point that shoot 'em ups are just a niche genre. Mm-hmm. It's very hard to make the case for shoot 'em ups, in the grand context of the gaming landscape. But it's just a very underappreciated game. So I don't know how you guys feel about Einhander. I certainly love it, but what do you think, Paul?
I thought it was good. I think your opinion of it is higher than mine. My issue with it really was that it just kind of felt sterile. It didn't really feel like it had the kind of personality that a Radiant Silvergun has. I'm not just talking about like story mode, even just like the color palette is a little bit dark and drab in Einhander. The action's great though. The fact that it's not that bullet hell subtype, obviously, that's a huge plus for me. And the soundtrack, you're right. I agree anyway. It's subjective, but I actually kind of liked how offbeat the soundtrack was. Again, not your typical fare for that type of game.
Yeah, Anthony, did you play it back in the day?
This was like there were certain times like with my PlayStation that I needed a game to fill like a little gap, little niche for me. At one point, I needed a platformer, and there was Klonoa, which it is what it was, you know, that kind of thing. And for me, Einhander was the shoot 'em up that I needed at the time, and it's a shame. It's a really good game, and I agree with Paul. Like, I don't think it can hold a candle to Radiant Silvergun, but as far as games that were released here in the US at the time, this was as good as it got. And I think it sucks that a lot of people haven't been able to play it since the PlayStation era, though. That's the only thing that kind of holds it back.
Yeah. That and the use of 3D in it is really good. At a time where these kind of games were kind of struggling to make the transition. It's a better, in that regard, it's definitely a better game than, like, say, Thunder Force 5, which, struggled a little bit more incorporating that 3D in there.
Yeah, they did. Yeah. They did. That's, to your point, because I remember on the previous episodes we were talking about how they had a problem transitioning. But, yeah, you're right. A Square of all companies, too, like, they were able to implement this, like, so perfectly.
Yeah, and it's funny because you say that it's sterile, Paul, but all the things that you mentioned were the reasons why I enjoyed it. I really liked the Blade Runner, inspired aesthetic. And I really liked how dark and oppressive it was because I felt like it was very cohesive in its identity. So maybe it didn't work for you because you were more accustomed to kind of like the more Japanese, anime inspired games like Radiant Silvergun.
Probably.
But for me, I hadn't even seen anime at the time. So, that was, I loved sci-fi even as a kid. And so this game kind of brought that kind of identity and tone to it. So what you saw as a negative, I saw as a positive, actually.
That Japanese cover art also gets it top 16 in my book.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So man, and then they change. Oh geez.
Yeah, the American cover art is a crime. That's a crime.
Yeah. We could do an episode on cover art that changed from Japan to the West.
Yeah.
And it would be terrible because this isn't a visual medium.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't think the North American cover is bad. I actually quite like it.
It's not bad.
The Japanese cover is so great.
The Japanese one, I think that one's so much. I just think it's clever. I like it.
Yeah. It's just a hand.
Yeah.
Literally. Because the game's name is One-Hander. Yeah. So you have a hand. That's the cover.
But it's X-rated. It looks super dope.
Yeah, and it's actually, it's so fortunate. It hasn't been re-released by Square.
Yeah.
They did a very good job during the PS3 era of re-releasing their PS1 games, and those were then playable on the Vita and also on the PSP. But Einhander was just one of those that got stuck behind. I don't know if there were some licensing issues, with respect to it, why they couldn't re-release it. And now the game goes for like $100 CIB. So it's kind of hard to play the game nowadays if you're not willing to splurge a little bit.
Yeah.
But it's definitely a game that's worth revisiting. I really do hope that Square not only brings it back, but maybe comes back with a sequel. I like its kind of Greek mythology inspired, story and plot, and the kind of war between the moon and this colony, and it's just I don't know. I really like everything about it. It's not, like I said, the best game of '98, but it's just a very cool, exciting and intriguing game from that just very prolific era of Squaresoft.
Yeah.
Do you think that excluding the story, it's worth importing if it's much cheaper that way?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the thing with importing it is that, you need to have some way to play it.
Yeah.
The PS1 is region locked, so at that point, if you're gonna get a Japanese PS1, to kind of play this, you might as well just get the US version.
Yeah.
I would say,
Fair
because
enough.
it's not cheap enough that it's like $50, to get it from Japan. So if you're gonna spend another $50 to get a Japanese PlayStation, then you might as well just get the North American version.
Fair enough.
Unless you're gonna import a lot of other games, in
Yeah.
which case it's a perfectly good investment. But yeah, that's Einhander, that's Parasite Eve. Those are my honorable mentions. And so let's close it out by having an honorable mentions to the honorable mentions. So we're going to insert some violence here. So cue the violence. And so this is the in memoriam section, the games that we didn't get to talk about. It's certainly more than 8, from, the ones that we've talked about. Actually 10 since we included Geoff. So these are the honorable mentions to the honorable mentions. So let us remember Fallout 2.
The one that not only got shafted from the tournament, but also got shafted from the honorable mentions.
The honorable mentions, I know.
Got shafted twice. And we actually considered this game as part of the original ones.
Yeah, it made it very close to that final 16.
It did.
And then we just don't even mention it today.
So carrying on with our in memoriam, Crash Bandicoot worked.
Yep.
I actually think the better platformer than Spyro the Dragon and even Banjo-Kazooie. So I don't know why this one was not picked. And I was honestly
you were
considering
for this one.
I was stumping for this. I was going to pick it over Einhander, and then I realized Einhander is just a game I couldn't skip talking about. But I wanted to pick it just to mention that it's better than Spyro.
Yeah, I mean,
and it's certainly...
we'll definitely... I think Fallout and Crash will both get their due in time with episodes. Like, I could definitely see us do a Fallout episode. A Crash episode, I don't know, but more likely than Spyro at this point.
For sure. I think we've talked enough about Spyro. Just that episode was good enough for me. So continuing on, Brave Fencer Musashi, another Squaresoft game that came out in 1998. Unfortunately, I don't think any of us had enough experience with it to kind of give it its proper due. And it certainly doesn't seem to have, the level of esteem, to kind of carry it into the round of 16.
It did have that Final Fantasy VIII demo though.
Well, and you know what? It's the toe ball of the era. It's weird, man. It kind of went from like being underrated, and now I think it's overrated.
Yeah.
It was a good game. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So carrying on, Rival Schools, another offbeat Capcom fighting game. Capcom was just pumping out these lovely games. Yeah. So Rival Schools, definitely a very, very different game, with a school, theme, and having different classes and stuff like that. So,
and very good for the PlayStation because it wasn't an arcade port. Like, this is a game that's developed for the console.
It's signed for it.
It didn't really suffer for that,
Yeah. I think this one's justifiably left off. It's too niche.
I would say so. So carrying on, Pocket Fighters, a very, very addicting game and one of the most competitive and awesome games to play with friends. So Pocket Fighters, another great Capcom gem, but actually a puzzle game. So
you're thinking of Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo.
Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo, yes, that's exactly what
I saw you put Pocket
about.
Fighter on the list, and I was like, okay, I'm not gonna.
Yeah.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
But no,
I'm actually
Fighter
thinking of that. Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, no, that is a hell of a game, and like you said, Ozzy, a great competitive puzzle game. Maybe even like the first great. Nah, Tetris was, yeah, never mind, I'll shut up about that. But as an alternative to Tetris, you could do a lot worse than Puzzle Fighter.
Yeah.
Exactly. So another great RPG, Breath of Fire 3. God, this is all like Capcom now. What's going on? But Breath of Fire 3, again, we don't think that we had enough experience with it to really kind of give it its proper due. And again, it's not a game that we think, has enough esteem to kind of carry it into the round of 16. But certainly worth a mention. Another game, House of the Dead. We all know House of the Dead. Yeah. It's lovely. Ultimately, I think we can all agree it's a little bit too light, to carry it into the top 16. Get it? Light. But House of the Dead, I know, Anthony, you were considering maybe talking about it, so I know that you love it. It just didn't have enough weight, in order to go.
It was a fun arcade game, but nothing more than that.
Yeah. So another game, Burning Rangers, came out on the Saturn, one of the last swansons of the Saturn era.
We gave you Panzer Dragoon Saga, and that's what you're gonna get.
That's all you Saturn people get.
That's it for you Saturn fellas. I mean, the 98 was a very bad year for the Saturn, unfortunately.
Yeah.
It's the year that it finally met its gruesome demise. So sorry, Bernie Stoller. You made very, very many kids unhappy, including Paul.
Indeed.
So another game that Geoff thought about including, but he ultimately decided against it. International Superstar Soccer 98. Yep. I don't know why he would pick this game.
I do.
I know exactly why I'd pick this game.
Well, I'm being very sarcastic here.
But it's also like, this is the first time FIFA was really challenged and surpassed. International Superstar Soccer really just elevated the whole genre. I know you guys don't quite see it, but trust me, it's a worthy inclusion.
Yeah. Konami, I mean, was the only competitor to FIFA, and eventually they did it with the winning 11 games, and the Pro Evo eventually became the Pro Evo game. So
exactly, it's all the same. Like, all the name changes probably didn't help, and including name changes across regions. Eventually it just became Pro Evo, and they consolidated. To their credit, they finally got that right.
Exactly.
But this was really kind of like the breath of fresh air in that genre.
Yeah. And to finish it out, the last game, honorable mention to the honorable mentions, is Bushido Blade 2. And I know, Paul, you have opinions about Bushido Blade.
I don't like it.
Yeah. But, a lot of people do. The first Bushido Blade was, from what I understand, a lot better than Bushido Blade 2. Bushido Blade 2 was seen as a step down. So I definitely don't have any qualms about not including it there. But then again, I mean, this honorable mentions to the honorable mentions is like a who's list of like Squaresoft and Capcom going up against each other. They just had a really good year, man.
Yeah.
So, the heydays of those, giants of the industry. So I think that's it.
I will say, I do have one more game that I feel compelled to add, because it's the game that I think most people have mentioned to me about not being in it. And that is King of Fighters 98. Since we kind of stole the look and name, I feel compelled to mention King of Fighters 98.
Yeah.
There's no love lost here with me. I'm not a huge King of Fighters fan personally, but
I mean, many people see it as the pinnacle of the series. Yeah. I mean, me personally, I prefer 97, but if people come to me and say 98's the pinnacle, I'm not really going to argue very hard. They were at the top of their game for a great series, so I can see why people would say that. Definitely not making the round of 16. Sorry, guys.
Yeah,
and
definitely not.
I'm as big a stan for King of Fighters as anybody, but it's not making the round of 16.
Now that you mention SNK, I should also mention Metal Slug 2 came out that year. Metal Slug 2 came out on the Neo Geo. It was amazing. I think it was in every way a step up from the first Metal Slug. It kind of took everything that made it good and just added a ton more stuff to it. So Metal Slug 2, and particularly its iteration as Metal Slug X, are probably the best representations of the Metal Slug franchise, and perhaps the best games in the Metal Slug franchise. I personally think Metal Slug X takes that title. So I don't think round of 16 material, but definitely one of the highlights of 1998. Did we miss anything? I'm pretty sure we did.
I think we're good.
Are we scraping the barrel here?
We'll never not miss something. This year is it's insane.
All right. Well, with that, I mean, I think we've gone long enough. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us on this special King of Games 98. This was probably the longest King of Games 98 episode that we've done, but it kind of deserved it because there were so many good games that came out this year. But it's been the Region Free Gamers. Again, we're we're the podcast that is fluent in gaming, but we can't speak. So If you like what you hear, like Paul mentioned twice, definitely go over to Apple Podcasts and, subscribe to us, maybe download some of the episodes. We have a ton of episodes at this point, certainly over 60, I think, at this point. I would definitely say maybe even over 70. So
we're
you have a
definitely in
huge
the
backlog.
70s.
Yeah.
Yeah. If there's a particular topic that you like, just download that. Some of our earlier episodes were a little bit rough, but, they still have a lot of heart, I would say.
They have charm.
Yeah, exactly.
We tried very hard.
And you can find us on Instagram at Region Free Gamers Podcast, and also find us on a website which we haven't done a very good job of keeping up to date, but that's Region Free Gamers. You can also contact us via email if you roll that way, and we don't judge. And also you can find us on Twitter at Region Free Gamer without the S. And so thank you everyone for listening, and until next time, I don't know, keep gaming.